morning. Almost noon, almost afternoon. My name is Bettina Ring, and it's good to be back in Marin County. And it's great to be here to be able to share in one of my favorite parts of the Geography of Hope. It's really an honor. This is actually my third Geography of Hope conference, and they've all been fantastic. I think they just keep getting better. And I remember the first one that I attended on ag and ranching, farming, and I was furiously taking notes, sitting in the audience and thinking about how happy I was that I wasn't at the podium. And that I didn't have to be standing up there in front of all the scholars, the great writers, the leaders in the room. So when Steve asked me to serve as moderator of this panel, you can imagine what came to mind. But it was really a delight to be able to say yes, and it was very humbling and intimidating. So I stand before you just very excited to be part of this and excited to be with the Leopold family, the immediate family and those, all of us that are in the circle of the Aldo Leopold family. I had the honor, privilege of working in the early stages with the planning committee for this Geography of Hope conference. And that was when I was serving as executive director of the Bay Area Open Space Council. I remember that first evening meeting at the Panama Hotel when we were trying to convince Steve that yes, he could indeed do one more Geography of Hope conference. It took some convincing, I must say, but we reminded him that Kate, his partner, would be right there beside him, along with the village in Point Reyes. Well, Kate and the village were there to help him, and they deserve so much recognition. They were all there, the planning team, the sponsors, but after 9 years of being in the Bay Area and 6 years in Marin County, in beautiful Marin County, I chose to move 3,000 miles away. Steve thought it was because of a career opportunity and to be closer to my family in Virginia, but it really was because I knew what was coming if I stayed on that planning committee. All the planning, the prep, the hard work, running around furiously. And I must say they've done a tremendous job. So I want to thank them again, everyone involved in this. Like Peter Forbes, I have many places that I've been able to call home. From Virginia, where I grew up, to Colorado, to California, and now being back, coming full circle with my career and being back home closer to Virginia in Washington, D.C. These places have grounded me in what really matters in life, and I have a long list, just as Peter does, that I could easily share with you. But one of the most special ones, or that really stands out among them all, is here in Marin County and West Marin. The people, the landscapes, the food, the wine, the culture, I could go on, but I just need to say it's just so good to be back and to be back among friends and old colleagues. As I look back on my career studying forestry and my connection to Aldo Leopold, it was really, from when I studied at Virginia Tech to now at the American Forest Foundation, there's really no one conservation leader, I think, that had more influence on my life, directly and indirectly, than Aldo Leopold. And for me, as a young child, I was fortunate to grow up in a family and felt that I had a strong land ethic from a very young age. But it really was at Virginia Tech in the mid-'80s, so I'll date myself, while I was studying forestry, that I became introduced to the Sand County Almanac. I was in Dr. Joe Rogenbrook's outdoor recreation class, and it was required reading. And I still have my copy, and I carry it with me to this day. It's dog-eared, it's highlighted, And I want to point out to Steve and Kate, it was only $2.75. I don't know if that's a sign of my old age or the fact that they just weren't charging enough then, or they were trying to take it easy on us college students. Hopefully that was it. But I refer to it often, and I've since been given a newer version, thank goodness, from Buddy Huffaker, and he's told me this is the one that I really should be reading from this day forward. There are definitely some differences in the two, and so I had the great opportunity after beginning with the American Forest Foundation to be with Buddy and our partners with Kurt and visit the shack and to have the first board meeting that I had with the American Forest Foundation there. And it was such a treat. If you haven't been there, I highly recommend it. I have bought copies for friends and family members and colleagues, and I will continue to do so. But the words of Aldo Leopold have grounded and inspired me and continue to do so. And like Leopold, I made many transitions during my career. I started off as a field forester, a county forester with the Virginia Department of Forestry. And as I moved through my career in urban forestry and into management with that state agency, it kept growing within me as far as that, the importance of how we're all connected and how it is more than just the land, it is land and people. And at times it seemed like certainly people were getting more attention than the land, but that we really had to hold all of those pieces. And that only grew exponentially as I moved west to Colorado and then on to the Bay Area when I served as director of the Bay Area Open Space Council. And being able to work with coalitions of public agencies and nonprofit organizations protecting and managing land. And here in the Bay Area in particular, we knew that we were only going to be able to have impact by looking at the ecological, the economic, and the social pieces, the outcomes that we wanted to have to be able to truly have impact. And that was really the only way we wanted to work. I've had the opportunity now to continue that thinking, working with the American Forest Foundation, supporting private landowners that own over 56% of the land. You'll probably be hearing more about that from Wendell. But when we look at those places that we need to be caring for, at the American Forest Foundation, we're focusing on places and issues now in partnership with the Aldo Leopold Foundation, the state forestry agencies, and others, so that we can have more impact on the land and in our communities. And so I've had the opportunity to come full circle to work again with Steve Kane, Maryland State Forester, who's on our board of directors and with us this weekend. We were colleagues and counterparts when I was in Virginia, and he's since been promoted to state forester and advises us, along with with Buddy from the Aldo Leopold Foundation and Joe Arrington, a great land steward that's here in the audience. So much sage advice and those individuals that were influenced by Aldo Leopold. Just a few more names. There's so many people in here that have impacted my life and my career with the connection to Aldo Leopold. And Steve asked that I first share my story as I pass it on to the others here that are going to be sharing theirs. And I would like to point out Peter Forbes, who you heard from earlier. Peter, when I first attended one of his workshops in New Mexico, he told the story about the wolf and the green fire, and it was really powerful. And then I had the opportunity to spend another week with Peter in Vermont 2 years later, and just thinking about and growing in what that meant to me, looking at the whole in the work that we do. And so I want to thank Peter for the good work the Center for Whole Communities and Peter himself does, and the ripple effect from that. And Steve Costa and Kate Levinson, building community through the bookstore, all that they're doing here with and through others and making a difference in this world. And Buddy, through the Aldo Leopold Foundation, now getting to think about how we can take the land ethic workshop and bring it to a larger audience, and how we can really think about building community and having more impact, and really taking the teachings and the writings of Leopold and making that live within the forestry community. I could tell you more about all the friends and the individuals that have influenced my life, but have touched me really through the land and through Aldo Leopold's writings again. It was because they all stepped back, I think. We all tried to pass that candle forward. Leopold has touched many lives, and I think in your conversations since arriving on Friday, you've heard about that and how that's happened. You've heard from our panelists. You've also heard how it's very different. It's similar, but it's different in each one of our lives. So now we're going to hear from some local folks. We're going to talk and be very rooted in place. And I'd like to ask you to think about what John Francis said and how he was able to listen in a way that he didn't listen before when he actually stopped speaking. As I introduced our panelists, and I'm going to do that in the beginning, we want this to be more like a conversation so that we can continue sort of the rich tapestry of their stories, because it is going to be very rich and you're in for a treat. And we're going to ask them to share how Leopold, the Sand County Almanac, or others that have been influenced by that have influenced them. First, we have Lauren Poncha. He's a Tamaulipas native, fourth-generation rancher. And after college, he took a job off the land, but he returned home. And even though he still has that job to support what he cares about with ranching, he now owns and manages Stemple Creek Ranch, and it's some of the best grass-fed beef, if you haven't had it. And he has 2 daughters, who I think are actually here in the audience. We have Deborah Walton, who owns Canvas Ranch in Bodega, involved with the Bodega Land Trust, and has been volunteering this weekend. After running an advertising firm, she chose to retire to Bodega and her ranch, and so we're going to hear more about Canvas Ranch in Bodega. A big Leopold fan. And Wendell Gilgert. He's the Working Landscape Program Director at PRBO, Conservation Science. Wendell is a Great Valley native and comes to PRBO from NRCS that we heard about earlier, Natural Resources Conservation Service. He had a 34-year career with them and most recently served as a Western Regional Wildlife Biologist and NRCS Partners in Flight in Portland. He brings a wealth of knowledge and experience to this area now with PRBO. And then we have Ken Brower. Many of you know in the room, and know his father as well, David, who knew his father. Ken is best known for his many books about the environment, national parks, natural places, many of them in hundreds of libraries and by major publishers, including several titles in the series The Earth's Wild Places. His most widely read book on Yosemite is in over 1,200 World Cat libraries, and many of his books have been published by National Geographic, and several have been translated into numerous languages. He is the oldest son of the late environmentalist David R. Brower. And last but not least, Huey Johnson, an environmentalist and a practical visionary. He's widely recognized for his pioneering work as a conservationist and environmental policymaker. He's founder and president of Resource Renewal Institute. He's the founder of many other organizations like the Greenbelt Movement International, a global arm of the Greenbelt Movement of Kenya, and the Aldo Leopold Society, which educates the public about the work of Aldo Leopold. Many of you know Huey from his early work with the Trust for Public Land, and you heard Steve speak about that the first night and that connection to Sand County Almanac. He also was with the Nature Conservancy, where he served as its Western Regional Director for 9 years, and he served as the Secretary of Resources for the state of California from 76 to 82. And during his tenure, he established conservation programs that doubled salmon populations and protected more than 1,200 miles of wild rivers. So we're going to start this conversation talking about the writing and the work of Leopold and land stewardship. And I asked each of the panelists, they could really do their own thing, but if they liked to start with a word that most resonated with them related to the writings and the work. And Wendy Johnson, who is a very dear friend, is usually the individual that is the moderator of the session. And I knew that I couldn't do Wendy justice here, but I will try to channel her. And I'll try to think about how we sort of create that space and then we hold that space to truly hear from the local people and to be rooted in community and in place. And so I'm going to ask, when I turn this to Lauren and his daughter, and her name?
This is Avery Jane.
Avery Jane, a beautiful name. Hi, welcome. So we're actually going to hear from Lauren first, and I'm going to pass the Sand County Almanac to him, and when he feels like he shared his story and he's ready to pass it on, if he'll pass the Sand County Almanac to Deborah. Thank you.
Thank you. So I didn't realize I was going to have a helper up here today, but it's an honor to be invited to be on this panel today. I'm a fourth-generation rancher up in the Tamales area, which is on the north end of Tamales Bay. It's actually a little town of Fallon is where our ranch is. And I grew up there thinking that the world was West Marin. The world was West Marin because that's what I saw. You know, I'd go to San Francisco and we'd get out, but I never realized how amazing this area was until I actually moved away. So it's absolutely incredible area. And I grew up, I didn't realize this at the time, but I had a lot of similarities to Aldo, Leopold in terms of the hunter-gatherer in me. Since I was a child growing up, I loved the outdoors and the hunting and the fishing and the gathering part of the environment and our local ranching community. And what I think I was blessed with early on in life is I could look back and wonder, or ask the questions and look back and wonder and say, what was this land like, 200 years ago? And it's still my dream. Probably not going to happen in my lifetime, but to be able to, maybe someday in another life, to be able to fly over this country and see what it looked like 200 years ago and how we as humanity have changed it in the last couple hundred years. And what I've been fortunate enough in my operation and my family's operation to see is the change in stewardship over time and how it's affected the environment. So when I was a young child, I grew up in a conventional agricultural system, and we managed things the best that we knew how at the time. And it was a very utilitarian operation where we tried to maximize the amount of production we could get off of the land and be able to produce the most amount of food possible for our community. And as I grew up and watched my dad, who was a really progressive leader in the agricultural community in terms of the conservation side of agriculture, we partnered with a group called the Shrimp Club and actually fenced off literally miles and miles of riparian corridor on our ranch to the point now where my operation's a little over 1,000 acres, and all of the riparian areas are fenced, which is over 5 miles of riparian areas. And we've planted over 1,000 trees. And with that, PRBO has actually monitored the different bird species that now live in our creek conservation areas, wildlife corridors, however you want to call them. And serendipitously, we've learned as we've gone, which I think Aldo Leopold would be excited about, and to see that we can both raise food on this great ranch land, but at the same time raise or live in harmony with a biodiverse, a huge array of different species that live there with us, and we can live in harmony. We all have to eat, right? So we have to do what's best in terms of being able to produce the most amount of food and do it the most responsible way. So I have a couple notes here I have to look at just to stay on track with my little Avery Jane here. So yes, as a child, I grew up as a hunter-gatherer. That actually drove a lot of my conservation efforts. I actually fought it a little bit when I was in my teens. My dad was fencing off these creeks that are in a floodplain, and I was saying, who's going to fix this fence? Because that's the like, I mean, this fence is going to get flooded out every year, and I don't want to fix it all the time. And these environmentalists, they want us to put this up, but they're not going to be the ones fixing it. So, no, it's true. And now, now 20 years later, I look at this and I look where and I have photos of it that we need to do a better job of sharing, that there was dirt all the way down to the creek, and the waters were warm and they'd get covered with algae, and now there's rocky stream bottoms, and there's a beautiful willow canopy, and there's tons of different birds that use it, and there's deer and coyotes and bobcats and badgers and foxes and all these different critters that live, raccoons, unfortunately skunks, and some other stuff, that live in this beautiful corridor, and it's just thriving with life. And it changed in my lifetime. I'm only 38 years old. They started doing that when I was maybe 15. So in the last 25 years, it's totally changed to a new ecosystem on our ranch. And it's way more biotic, I guess you would say, in all those terms. So it's a good thing. So let's see. The change in the last 100 years in our whole environment in this area has been dramatic, as you all know. And in many ways, I don't think the agrarian community necessarily means to do harm with new practices. But there's not a book that says this is how you grow wheat on a hillside. And in the 1850s, when we were trying to do utilitarian methods to feed the local communities, there was some poor practices that are not being repeated now, but we've paid the consequences. It doesn't mean what I've noticed is what's absolutely amazing is Mother Nature has an amazing way of repairing herself if you give her time. So, speaking of time, am I doing okay? Okay, so, and you don't know what you don't know. So now going like full circle on the vision of where we're at, our operation, we raise grass-fed beef and lamb, and on our 1,000 acres, we have about 100 different pastures, permanent pastures. We rotate the cattle around. The cattle don't drink from the creeks anymore. Now we have solar pumps that pump water to the tops of the hills, and the gravity flows back to fill 40 different water troughs that we've put in. A lot of this has been cost share or funded through cost shares from the NRCS and the Environmental Quality Incentives Program. And it's been an amazing program that's allowed me as a rancher to do what I wanted to do and be able to afford to do what I wanted to do, both for the public benefit and for our own benefit. So I look at my synergies with Leopold as now I have an obligation to take care of this ranch land and to take care of the environment in our area. One, for myself, and one, to feed all of you folks, but two is for my little girls, and hopefully they have an exciting business that they want to come back to that's thriving with biodiversity and new opportunity. So that's kind of where I'm at. And then one other thing is I wanted to read you a quote that I just saw this morning that I thought was great from Aldo, and it said, "Perhaps no one but a hunter can understand how intense an affection a boy can feel for a piece of marsh. I came home one Christmas to find that land promoters, with the help of the Corps of Engineers, had diked and drained my boyhood hunting grounds on the Mississippi River bottoms. My hometown thought the community was enriched through this change. I thought it was impoverished." And that's how I feel, so.
Well, Lauren has a prop with Avery Jane.
Yeah, exactly.
And I I brought a prop. Not nearly as adorable, but... Acts of creation are ordinarily reserved for gods and poets, but humbler folk may circumvent this restriction if they know how. To plant a pine, for example, one need be neither god nor poet. One need only a good shovel. If his back be strong and his shovel sharp, there may eventually be 10,000. And in the 7th year, he may lean upon his shovel and look upon his trees and find them good. Aldo, Leopold. I'm not a 4th generation farmer. I'm a brand new farmer. And I've been doing it for 12 years. I'm also not in Bodega, but thank you for putting me there because it's beautiful. I'm actually one toe over the line in Sonoma County in Two Rock, which is even smaller than Fallon. I think there's 12 of us there. I'm not really sure. But Canvas Ranch, which is my farm, like Aldo Leopold's shack, was without life when we moved there. A blank canvas, hence the name, when we bought it 12 years ago. We didn't plant 10,000 trees, only 217. Just like our sharp shovel, we see ourselves as tools in acts of creation. We planted trees, shrubs, food. We added sheep and goats for fiber and to provide an ecological solution for weed and grass management. I lease out our sheep to vineyards so they can manage their grasses organically. We learned to dry farm potatoes and tomatoes from a farmer who was 4th generation and lived on Fallon Road in order to conserve water, because in our area we didn't have very much. We added ancient heirloom grains in restful rotation with our vegetables: farro, flax, rye, spelt. And we watched as the entire biology and ecology of the farm changed. Clovers replaced thistles in our pastures. A deep chasm in the field healed itself. The soil became rich and yielding of the most delicious food. Birds nested and bees buzzed. We control predators not with guns, but with livestock guardian dogs and gopher-loving cats. We have quite a few of them. We leave an ugly, unused grain silo alone because it is home to magical barn owls who return year after year to nest and birth their young. We coax food from the earth, not beat it into submission. The teamwork that goes on in our soils and in our pastures also happens in our community. Agricultural students come to learn what it takes to grow food. Community-supported agriculture, CSA, which is what we have, our members receive that food and help us afford to grow more. Young kids come to taste a just-picked sugar snap pea or pull a carrot from the ground for the first time, and they smile and ask for more. And that is one of the greatest acts of creation there is. And I'm privileged to be a farmer. Thanks.
Well, good morning. God, that is tepid. Good morning.
Good morning.
There we go, a little enthusiasm. Had to do that with a group yesterday, too. Just, there's something about getting a response that gets you fired up. And I don't really need that. I'm here to, this is a little bit like when I was a kid. Our church locally was a non-denominational church, but, in truth, most of the people there were kind of like Southern Baptists, so there's a lot of amens and testimonies and hallelujahs, so this is actually kind of familiar to me. When I was about 5 years old, that's as close as I can remember, I was raised on a family farm that had been my family since 1851, and about 120 miles as a crow flies southeast of here in eastern San Joaquin County. And when I was a kid, Silent Spring had not come into our country. We had a dryland farm. It was dissected and intersected with creeks and sloughs. And for a young boy, let me tell you, there's just nothing better. And I recall hearing this sound that Aldo Leopold talks about, and here's my prop. And I heard this sound, and it was way off in the distance, and I couldn't see him. What's that sound? What's that sound? And I ran in to get my dad. At the time, I was turning over some logs and was in our old lumber pile looking for skinks and snakes and stuff, and I heard this noise, and I just couldn't find it. I couldn't find it. And I went in and got my dad, and he goes, "That's the sandhills." He said, they're heading north. And I said, heading north? Where are they coming from? Where are they going to? And, you know, he had a little time, and he was patient with me, but not that patient. He had things to do. He had a farm to run. But it was about a month later that for my birthday, he got me one of the little Zim golden books. Do you remember those? One of birds has the red B on it. You know, they all had, whether it was fish or mammals or whatever, the first letter was always red. Boy, talk about my new Bible. I read that thing, and even though I couldn't read, I could see the pictures. And Dad said, well, you'll read it one of these days. And look at the maps and look at the pictures, and, you know, I could identify these birds. And I would ask him what the words meant. And so as I moved through my childhood on the ranch, a big flood came through our country in 1957. And we had a creek that went through our house, and out in front of our house was the county road, Mariposa Road. And as the water dried down, my brother and I were going to rescue the fish, and there were thousands of fish in that drying area. And my uncle, who was a good fisherman, identified a couple of the big fish as salmon and steelhead. Eastern San Joaquin County, salmon and steelhead, 1957. 2 years later, here comes the Corps of Engineers, and they put in a flood control dam. And once they put in the flood control dam, then they came in and they wanted to improve our creeks. And they came in and straightened and simplified and cut the riparian forest. And right after that, here comes the land graders. And our country at that time, and it's hard to believe the San Joaquin County farmscape in such a short period of time, went from a valley oak savanna grassland with small dry land farming that was periodically grazed by sheep and cattle. Within a period of 10 years, it went to very intensive agriculture, leveled out the trees, leveled out the creeks, straightened, simplified, got rid of the fences, and all the things that I used to know as a kid started going away. The pheasants, the coyotes, the deer, certainly the salmon, they went away, and they haven't been back. And, you know, that silent spring kind of stuck with me, and even though I was a farm kid, every time I saw one of those big oaks fall, it would just piss me off. I hated to see it. And so there was something internally, even though I couldn't externalize it because I was in a farming community and that was sort of the moray, but inside I was burning and I was seething. And when I was a sophomore in high school, we were told in the English class, go pick up a book and your book report for the next month. You know, so they gave you the whole period to go in and shuffle around the library. And in PRBO Conservation Science, we have a first edition copy of Sand County Almanac, and this was the same copy with the geese on front that I pulled off the shelf as a sophomore in high school. And as I was reading through it, I came to this passage. And it's from Sketches Here and There, Wisconsin. And of course, I had no idea where Wisconsin was, but our ability to perceive quality in nature begins as an art with the pretty. It expands through successive stages of the beautiful to values as yet uncaptured by language. The quality of cranes lies, I think, in this higher gamut, as yet beyond the reach of words. This much, though, can be said. Our appreciation of the crane grows with the slow unraveling of earthly history. His tribe, as we know, stems out of the remote Eocene. The others of the fauna of which he originated are long since entombed within the hills. When we hear his call, we hear no mere bird. We hear the trumpet in an orchestra of evolution. He is a symbol of our untamed past and of the incredible sweep of millennia which underlies and conditions the daily affairs of birds and men. And so they live and have their being, these cranes, not in the constricted present, but in the wider reaches of evolutionary time. Their annual return is the ticking of a geological clock. And I read that and I go, my God, he felt the same thing I did. And so I was just, energized, charged up, reread this book several times, and I had to be cut short by Mr. Klessens, my English teacher, because I was going on a little too long about Leopold as a sophomore in high school. Later, when I set it down and kind of went on my way and got my undergraduate degree, I was working on a graduate degree at Cal State University, Chico, in soils. And I picked up a copy of Audubon, the bicentennial issue of Audubon. Anybody remember that one? There was an essay in there by Leopold, really nicely illustrated. And I read that again, as I hadn't read it the first time. And in that reading, it really embedded what I was going to do as a career. X had marked time in the limestone ledge since the Paleocene seas covered the land. Time to an atom locked in a rock does not pass. The break came when a bur oak nosed down a crack and began prying and sucking. In the flash of a century, the rock decayed and X was pulled out and up into the world of living things. He helped build a flower, which became an acorn, which fattened a deer, which fed an Indian, all in a single year. Encapsulated in that essay was really little known to me at the time, was going to sort of encapsulate my life's work. The holistic, looking at processes, natural history, working with people, working with the land, working to try to maintain land health and an ethic in the people that manage those lands. Thank you.
I loved Lauren's story of the fences that he had to fix, because I had a sort of similar story with my father. When he and Clem Miller and Secretary Udall and all the local activists were trying to establish the seashore, I said, "Why do you want to do that?" Because we had all those beaches to ourselves then. And I said, you're going to bring all these park visitors in, but I think I came to the same conclusion Lauren did, that it was probably best in the end. And it's funny, I'm third generation from Two Rock farmer. My father's mother was from Two Rock, so although we weren't farmers for the intervening generations. But Wallace Stegner, when he tried to, he was vague about the origins of his wilderness letter, which contains the Geography of Hope line, and he thought my father must have elicited it from him, and I thought so too. Until I did a book last year on my father's centennial, in which I interviewed a number of people, a couple of them, Huey was one of them, and John DeGraff in the room is another, for a book of recollections about my father. And I interviewed David Pessin, and he said, no, the letter was written to me. And he had, as a young forestry student, had written to Stegner saying they were doing the Outdoor Resources Review Commission and project where he needed a ringing quote, so he wrote Stegner, and Stegner responded with this beautiful wilderness letter that encapsulates all that we're talking about. And Stegner would later say, I spent my career as a novelist and an essayist, and this thing I dashed out in a half a day is what I'm remembered for. It's the quote that I'm really remembered for. And Stegner, of course, there's a direct line from Stegner to Leopold to Thoreau. And in a lot of their ideas, but especially this idea of blank spaces on a map. The geography of hope idea of Stegner's is that these places that are, these wild places are valuable to us even if we never go there. If we only go and stand on the edge of these places, they're valuable to us spiritually because we know they're there. Even if we never go, they're the geography of hope. And this idea really descends directly from Leopold, who, I forget the line exactly, but what use are 40 freedoms when there's no empty place on a map? I probably misquoted him, but he, and I think he says something, how glad he was to be young when there were wild places to be young in. And that idea goes right back to Thoreau, who's doing the same thing, who's said very similar stuff. So this one idea, but the whole complex of ideas, there's this chain. And in fact, if you read Leopold carefully, you realize his debt to Thoreau. He was a great student of Thoreau. Was his dissertation on Thoreau? I don't know, but he definitely had sometimes you think he had too much a debt to Thoreau. I don't think so, but his rhythms, the way he observed the world, some of his language were very Thoreauvian. And my own thought is we can't have too many people with a lot of debt to Thoreau. That's that's a great situation to be in. But I did a book with a local photographer, Michael and Denise Sewell in Forest Knolls here. We did a photo illustrated Sand County, a big exhibit format sized book on Sand County, and we went back, and Buddy Huffaker and Nina put us up in the shack and got to live in the shack for a few days. And it was a very interesting way to connect with Leopold, who I hadn't read since I was quite a bit younger. And live in the shack, and it's such a tactile experience of the guy. Buddy and Nina and everybody left his bird bands in the room with little notes from Leopold. So you look up on the mantle, the fireplace, and you say, "Oh my God, bird bands from Leopold," and his notes, his handwritten notes, and that kind of direct connection made me really start to think about him. And for the first time in a disciplined way, as I wrote the foreword to this book, and it really does seem to me, as I've thought about this, that there are four sacred texts in environmentalism, and one is Walden, and the next is one not so many people know about, but it's Man and Nature by Thomas Perkins Marsh. It's a book we've mostly forgotten, but it was essential at its time. The next was Sand County, and I think the last is Rachel Carson and Silent Spring. They're different books, but there's a thread that runs through them, and they're all, I guess, a table should have four legs, and those for me are the four legs of the table of this movement. And the other thing I found from living in the shack, we lived in the shack, but I wandered the farm every day. I tried to get to the river every evening at sunset because the cranes came over. And these were my first sandhill cranes that I'd really known. And in the evening, they flew over the river, this great sound they make. I'd never seen cranes before, but the way they drop their landing gear when they're about 200 feet above the ground, their legs already come down. And so I tried to make that every day. And just to follow the guy's footsteps around, you got a sense of the man from the place, because place and man, and this particular man, are so connected. But one of the things I thought about is how much an old-style field biologist he was. We talk about him as a writer a lot, but what a kind of an old school field zoologist and botanist that he was. And I think this is the kind of person we're losing a little bit. We still have some, but But the scientists I meet nowadays in the field, it's a different breed. And I've been lucky enough to meet some of the old style guys. Bob Stebbins at Berkeley is one of them. And Carl Koford, the Condor Man, who were both Starker Leopold's buddies at the Museum of Vertebrate Zoology in Berkeley. Stebbins has written this. He's the best scientific illustrator according to almost everybody in the world. His Western Field Guide to Western Reptiles and Amphibians is this wonderful eye for detail in animals. Koford was the California condor expert. He wrote the book on California condors, and he was the kind of guy who spent 5 weeks in a little sandstone cave eating bread while he watched condors. And it was very interesting to me to watch he also believed strongly, and I and my father, Friends of the Earth at the time, both were persuaded by him that we don't want to take the last 21 condors out of the wild. We don't want to take them all out of the wild. We want to leave some of them in for the continuity with that space. An animal isn't just its genes, it's an interaction with a place. You interrupt that and you're in trouble. When you take all condors out and put them in zoos to breed them, you lose the wise animal that knows the system. It's not easy to be a condor. You have to compete with golden eagles in the air. You have to compete with other turkey vultures at the carcass. There's all kinds of things you have to learn. If you take that culture, that condor culture out, you're in trouble. And it was interesting for me to watch the next generation of condor scientists who were all the radio telemetry guys. And it was clear to me that what they really want to do is put a radio in every bird and be able to sit in a room at a computer screen and see where that bird was. And it's so different from the Aldo style and from the Bob Stebbins style, or even from the Darwin style. These guys were generalists. They were interested in the whole system. They were on the land a lot. And we don't have as many as we used to have. One of the interesting things that happens to me with Koford is you read a paragraph into his book, The California Condor. And I'm thinking as a literary guy, but you read a paragraph into that book and you can begin to see this bird from his just description, from sitting in that cave, watching the bird. Within a few sentences, he begins, almost novelistic skills, you begin to see the bird. You listen to these radio telemetry guys, you can't see the bird for hours talking to them. You can see the technology and stuff. So this is one of the things that Aldo had, I think. He had this we've talked about rooted. He was rooted in these places. He was on the land all the time. Leopold and his kids were doing this phenology. When does the bird arrive? When does it leave? This is the kind of thing, it's no accident that the land ethic grew out of this kind of observation. These things are connected. I've been lucky enough to be with some real subsistence hunter-gatherers around the world, real subsistence people who live entirely off the land, and I think we may be the last generations that know this kind of people, because I think they're going fast, and something happens when you're with these people. I can think of one example, and I was doing a story in French Guiana, and we had an Amazonian Indian from the other side of the Guiana Shield who was leading us into the forest. And I was with really a canny French tropical botanist who'd been all over the rainforest. I'd been all over the rainforest. Here's a red dirt road, big primary forest on either side of the road. We follow this. This Indian's going to take us into the forest. We're not 2 steps into this forest before this Indian turns around and he looks at us like, what's wrong with you people? We're not going to see anything. He was barefoot. You're not going to see anything if we go into the forest like this, making this kind of noise. It was the damnedest look on his face. And that's the kind of man we're losing. One more example is I've done a lot of books in Micronesia, the tiny islands and atolls and high volcanic islands of Micronesia. I did a book on a Palauan conservationist who was also a great spear fisherman. I followed him around one day. I followed him underwater with these great 9-foot wooden spear guns that Palauans use, amazing guns. They're just amazing with them. He's 90 feet down, and he's waiting for the fish to come. And you're thinking, breathe, but he doesn't. He's just sitting there. And but what I really remember was watching him in the eelgrass shallows. And he borrowed this spear from an old guy who had roped off the entrance to this little cove so that the fish at the high tide were trapped in this cove in the eelgrass. This big bowed spear, casting spear this guy had, and he's waiting around, and these fish are darting through the eelgrass, and he's hitting with a spear every time. And his fingers are dancing up and down the shaft. You know, for a deep throw, his hand is near the point. For a shallow throw, he's going back. And I keep waiting for him to miss, and I don't see how he can hit these things, but he never misses them. And I said, how do you get them when they move so fast? He says, well, actually, the stationary fish is the hard one, because when the fish is moving, that corrects for the refraction of the water. It gives you another. But when he's just sitting there, that's the hardest. But he didn't miss those either, and he's aiming for different parts of the fish. And in the middle of this, I'm saying, wait a minute, what's going on? And it's something different. It's a quantum difference in understanding where you live, when you have to live entirely off that place, especially when it's a complicated system like a coral reef. Every marine biologist I know who's known these people says these people have folk PhDs in marine biology. They know way more than I know. And the young Palauans who have jobs and only go out on the weekends, they'll say, my grandfather, I'll never know what he knows, because they're out there every day learning these systems. And I think there's a long digression, but I think that's what Leopold had. I think he was rooted in this place. I think his influence on me has been less on my prose than just on the underlying ideas that he gave us, the land ethic idea, and that's so important. I told Dave Foreman I was coming here from Earth First, and in fact, I sent him that great Leopold picture, because Dave is kind of handicapped now and just sits in a chair looking at birds, and that looks to me like what Aldo's doing in that picture. But he said, make sure at this conference that they talk about wilderness and wolves, because his sense is that we've been drifting away from that part of Aldo's legacy. And I think that's right. I think we have been. Dave is a wilderness guy. He started in the Wilderness Society, was one of the founders of Earth First. So he didn't think this slow way we're going is enough, and he was one of the pioneer eco-terrorists. He's a monkey wrencher, and he's sort of retired from that now. The FBI infiltrated his outfit and got him good. But he. I think he's right. I think we missed that a little in this conference. It's almost as if the Baraboo legacy of Aldo, which is community, sustainability, restoration, has sort of swamped the other part, which is the Gila wilderness side. That's where the wolf with the green fire died, and that was a huge part of what he was thinking about. And I feel there needs to be a little correction about the wilderness idea that we've been hearing at this meeting. And one of the notions is that it's never been a notion that there were no people in wilderness. That's not on the part of any wilderness advocates I know. And my father that was what drove him more than anything. There's no place on Earth that hasn't had people. By that definition, there is no wilderness on the Earth, not even in Antarctica, where we profoundly changed the system now. I mean, the first man set foot there in 1826, a sealer, American John Davis. And until then, it was a wilderness, but it's not anymore. So that was never the case. I don't think in America it's true that we put very many native people or anybody else off the land. It's happened in Africa, and it's a big mistake. We put Maasai off the parks, but this idea that people have been displaced, it's happened a little, but not much in our parks, in our national parks and the wilderness. I think we need to, I kind of think the wilderness idea has fallen into the hands of academics more than it should. I think there's a kind of, it's not sophistry, but there's a too clever by half interpretation of this wilderness idea. Wilderness, my father's definition of it was wilderness is where the hand of man has not set foot. And I think it's a great, funny definition. He means that you can have Homo sapiens there, but you can't have, you don't want Homo faber there, man the builder. It's one place where nature's laws sort of rule a thing. Why is it important? You know, Thoreau said in wildness is the preservation of the world. What did he mean? I think I know part of what he meant. He meant that this is the universe, this is creation the way it was before humans started monkeying with it. This is where we can learn what nature or evolution, God, whoever it is, intended before humans started scrambling it. And it's a place we can go back. It's a touchstone place. Dave Foreman, among others, he loves the opening of Sand County, and he loves the part about where Leopold says there are people who can live without wildness. There are others who cannot. And Foreman says, I'm a cannot. It's a new organization he started, the Cannots, cannot live without wildness. And I'm that way. I mean, I could, but I don't want to. And I think we need to do a little more homework in some of the stuff. Invasives, for example. We've been talking about invasives versus native plants, native organisms in this conference. And the fact is that invasive species are the primary way that we're destroying ecosystems on the planet. They are native plants and animals, exotic plants and animals that we've introduced are the main cause of deterioration of environments. They're the main driver of extinction. And this is just a fact. So it's not just a little thing. It's not just a little prayer before we cut the weed. That's thinking very much too locally. It's a bigger problem. And I also think we've talked a lot about man being part of nature, and that's true, but it's also not true. It's sort of an ideal. I think it's important to remember that the man and nature duality is a very good way of thinking about the problems confronting us now. We don't want to forget that, to a large extent, we've been outside nature, and we've been against nature. And anyway, I've talked too long, so.
I'm going to stand up. Well, let me just give it a go. See how it goes here. I would like to read the exact quote that you quoted. He stole my thunder. I was going to come up. We were supposed to have one word that typified our appreciation. This is also a first edition. Oh. Podium? No, I want to do this. Thank you. So here's the quote. It's in the first sentence of the foreword of the Sand County Almanac. There are some who can live without wild things, and some who cannot, and so on. I'm one who cannot. And the idea of having a new society of cannots would be a great idea, and I think next year's conference ought to be titled The Cannots. And I say this because we've gotten a bit away, it seems to me. Well, let me start out differently. I'm a disciple of Aldo Leopold. And I went through a long journey looking for his example, and including wandering around the world alone a couple of years, visiting old battlefields and history. And finally, one night, and I got back, and I was in a research team at Lake Tahoe, and couldn't go out on the lake, and I was grumping away about society and mishandling of environment. And the guy I was playing chess with said, geez, you sound like Aldo Leopold. I said, who was that? And he turned around and pulled out Sand County, and I immediately read it and bought a copy and titled to my wife-to-be. and it's dated 1/26/1962. Huzzah, this book will be my drum. And so it has been, and my wife mentions that from time to time. I've seemed to be totally focused on that ever since. You might, as my partner, wave your hand. If I look now, or look then, at what I wanted to be, one should lead from strength. And I'd had experience in industry very successfully, and I'd learned how to survive and move things. I thought, well, I can bring that application here, maybe. And I decided that to be a generalist, to be comfortable with conflict, to not get stuck in science, a series of themes would be very useful to what I wanted to achieve, and it has worked out very well. I've been deluged with career recognitions by the box many years later. The theme that really appealed to me was public trust. The idea that all those people, Steve talks here about my requirement that everybody read a San County Almanac that works for me. And he was one of my employees at the Trust for Public Land when I started it. The first thing I did was hand him that, and he tells the story very well. But instead of sending him out in the wilderness, we sent him to Oakland. And he stacked up a whole bunch of landscapes saved in Oakland. Why do that? Well, we have to save places in between the wilderness we want to preserve in permanence and lands where people can use at the same time without having to go that far. And I was the first employee of the Nature Conservancy west of the Mississippi and saved a lot of landscape. And then later I started the Trust for Public Land and saved a lot of landscape. There are millions of acres there. But some of my most appreciated effort has been part of the community that saved the landscape between here and the Golden Gate Bridge. That doesn't exist because of friendly work. You had to go out nose to nose and deal with corporations and developers. You had to be principled. You had to have some source. And Leopold was it for me. And there are others in the audience who were there. And all of us care a great deal about wilderness. That's what inspired me to get going. I spent a year of my life in Idaho working on a wilderness bill. I got a job teaching school. I didn't have a teaching certificate as a way of doing it. So I want to point out one spot I'm missing. When selling the San County Almanac, I accepted a job in the California state government once, and I told the governor he was going to be on his cabinet in charge of environment for the state. And I said, well, I've got some requirements. I knew you get to negotiate once when you're getting a political appointment before you sign the document agreeing to do it. I said, what I'm going to do is get a 2-week vacation or something. And he said, well, at least go over and say hello to your staff. And there was a skyscraper, and they opened the door and said, lots of luck. And I didn't even know what the thing did. Anyway, I got up, and everybody in my office was all antsy. There was about a dozen secretaries, and I didn't really know what was going on. But I said, well, I'm leaving for 2 weeks. And they all were very nervous and said, well, what can we do? And they knew what I didn't know, and that is their jobs were in my hands. And I got to the door on my way out. I said, oh, they said, isn't there something we can do? I said, yeah, I wouldn't promote anybody or hire anybody that hasn't read a San County Almanac. I went out the door. And there were 14,000 employees in the agency. And I've always felt I should go back and ask for a cut in the commissions from that deluge of sales that went on the next 2 weeks. Well, I've been very thankful for the inspiration of the San County Almanac. Let me add, I think very highly of the river, the Mother of God. I was talking one day to Leopold at the preserved. I said, Nina, you know, to me, for the professional, that's more important than the sand encounter. She said, yes, it is. So it isn't just a collection of papers, as one of the authors, whom I've long wanted to meet, said in his speech. Well, if I look today, you know, the idea that Leopold advanced is so complex and so broad and so appealing in so many different ways. We're growing, it seems to me. Speeches given here, one speaker, like the Coon Valley chapter, I always thought that was the one that ought to be edited out of the book. So I could easily have debate and differences with many dimensions of his thought. The guy was absolutely talented, as we all know he wouldn't be here. It seems to me that we're at a point where we ought to realize that some of his themes have matured and are heading in new directions. I think Mr. Francis is saying, let's all shrink back and whatever, you know, and it was a beautiful statement. Well, there are a dozen ideas here, all of which deserve discussion, thought, and development. And it seems to me it's good to look back in history when human beings run into a situation like this. Now, I'd use the example of religion as an analogy. We've had, the last couple of weeks, a drum roll of interest in the subject. And I would, though I'm not a Catholic, I would look at the Catholic Church. And it has many divisions. Benedictines and Jesuits, for instance. The Jesuits won one. And it was a good idea to be able to have these diverse interests as a division within the church, but not tearing it apart so mine is better than yours, which is a tendency we're getting into here. We're forgetting wilderness, in my opinion. I've heard it mentioned very little in this conference. And it's been the fuel to fire a lot of us willing to confront forces that have been devastating to nature. And I don't want to lose it. I don't want my kids to lose it, nor my grandkids. So I hope next year you call it the cannots. Thank you.
Thank you so much for speaking your truth and sharing your story. And just to share a few of the themes that I heard in closing. We can live in harmony. The hunter-gatherer in us, we have an obligation to the land, a legacy for Avery, Jane, and others. Privileged to be a farmer. The importance of understanding where you live. Becoming comfortable with conflict and holding that tension, realizing that we all have similarities and we have differences. Thinking about the thread that runs through it all. And how can we leave what we are to become what we are becoming? That transformation, like Steve Dunsky shared with us the first night. How do we remain rooted in place? And it was just so wonderful to hear the stories, the local ranchers, the local professional managers, resource managers, the local leaders. We've got to continue to share the light and pass the candle on. And I think the truth of the matter is that it comes back to relationships and to that great quote that we've all love and we've been hearing since Friday night, the relationship of people to each other and the relationship of people to the land. Let's continue to hold and embrace that tension and continue the dialogue and the conversation as we move to our next panel. Thank you.